Kennedy compound was the house you already knew. 3 white buildings on Nantucket Sound that taught America what a political family was supposed to look like. 6 waterfront acres in Hyannis Port, Massachusetts. Campaign headquarters for a presidential election. The summer White House of the youngest president in modern history. The compound survived the assassination, the second assassination, the scandals, the Senate decades, and the slow erosion of everything the Kennedy name once commanded. And it still stands, still white, still facing the water. But for 63 years, one daughter lived 1,000 miles away in institutional care, removed from every image the compound was built to project. How does the most famous family house in American politics spend half a century projecting wholeness while hiding the daughter whose absence made that wholeness possible? In 1926, a man who had already made a fortune in banking, in movies, and in the darker tributaries of American commerce, rented a summer cottage on Marchant Avenue in Hyannis Port, Massachusetts. Joseph P. Kennedy was 37 years old, the father of 8 children, and by every measurable standard, a success. But Boston had not quite agreed. The Cohasset Country Club, bastion of inherited Protestant money, had made it clear that an Irish Catholic Democrat, no matter how rich, no matter how connected, was not welcome at its tables. The rejection stung, and Joseph Kennedy, who kept a careful ledger of every slight, responded the way he always would. He found a better stage. By the end of the decade, he had purchased the Hyannis Port cottage outright. The exact year shifts depending on the source. Some Kennedy-linked accounts say 1928. The National Park Service nomination points to 1929. But the fact that matters is what he did with it. The property sat on roughly 6 waterfront acres along Nantucket Sound, a generous stretch of lawn, a private beach, a dock, and a main house that Joseph immediately began to expand. The original structure had been built in 1904, a solid Cape Cod summer house of white clapboard and dark shutters, the kind of architecture that signals old money ease even when the money is new. Joseph added rooms, staff quarters, a motion picture screening room in the basement, a sauna, a sun porch, a sports room, a 4-car garage, and eventually a swimming pool and tennis court. The National Park Service nomination describes a property designed to make labor invisible and leisure look effortless. Shaded porches, servants' bedrooms tucked away from the family's living spaces, a kitchen and pantry infrastructure built for entertaining at scale. None of it was accidental. Joseph Kennedy was constructing something more ambitious than a vacation home. He was building the domestic stage on which a family of future senators, ambassadors, and presidents would learn to perform. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, his wife, understood the project as clearly as he did. She was the daughter of John Honeyfitz Fitzgerald, a former mayor of Boston, and she brought her own instinct for discipline and display to Hyannis Port. The house ran on her schedule. Meal times were fixed. Conversations were directed toward current events and competition. The children, Joseph Jr., John, Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward, were expected to sail, to swim, to win, and to appear before their parents as a unit. The compound was not merely a home. It was a rehearsal space. And what the Kennedy children rehearsed there, summer after summer, was the appearance of vitality, togetherness, and invulnerability that would one day become America's most famous family image. The irony is structural, and it begins here. The man who built this machine for projecting wholeness had been turned away from a country club. The family that would come to symbolize American arrival and belonging started from exclusion. And the house that would eventually represent the most celebrated political dynasty of the 20th century began as a rented cottage that an outsider bought and remade in his own image. Not because it was the best house on the Cape, but because it was the house no one could take away from him. Among the 9 Kennedy children who spent their summers at Hyannis Port, Rosemary was the third born, and the first whose life would be shaped less by what she achieved than by what her family decided she could not be allowed to become. The official biographical summary, maintained by the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, describes her early years in careful, institutional language. Rosemary was slower to crawl, slower to walk, and slower to speak than her siblings. She had learning difficulties that would today likely be classified as a mild intellectual disability. But the same summary makes clear that Rosemary was not removed from family life. She participated, she sailed, she swam. She was present at the compound in the summers, visible in the photographs, seated at the table during Rose Kennedy's structured dinners. As a teenager, she kept a diary. The entries are not the writing of someone locked away or hidden from the world. They describe dances, concerts, visits to friends, the ordinary texture of a young woman's social calendar in the 1930s. In 1938, when Joseph Kennedy was appointed United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James's, Rosemary traveled to London with the family. She and her sister Kathleen were presented at court alongside their mother. The photographs survive. Rosemary in white, poised, smiling, indistinguishable in composure from the siblings who would later become senators and diplomats. This matters because of what comes next. The woman who would be erased from the Kennedy story was not absent from the beginning. She was inside the frame. She was at Hyannis Port. She was at the embassy in London. She was, by every visible measure, a Kennedy daughter, participating in the family's rituals and appearing in its public image. The erasure that followed was not a continuation of something that had always been true. It was a decision. And that decision was made not by Rosemary, but by her father. When the family returned from London in 1940, something had shifted. Eunice Kennedy Shriver would later describe Rosemary's condition as worsening, greater irritability, more difficulty managing her behavior, episodes that frightened the family. The JFK Library's official account, written with the institutional caution of a presidential archive, states that by the age of 22, Rosemary had become increasingly irritable and difficult, and that Joseph Kennedy grew alarmed at the possibility that her behavior could embarrass the family, or worse, that she might be taken advantage of sexually. Joseph Kennedy was not a man who tolerated problems he could not control. His fortune had been built on the ability to read a situation, act decisively, and move on. He had left Hollywood after extracting its profits. He had left the ambassadorship when its political usefulness expired. He managed his children's lives with the same transactional precision he applied to markets. And in 1941, he heard about a procedure that promised to solve the problem of Rosemary. The procedure was a prefrontal lobotomy. Its leading American practitioners were Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts, who by that year had performed fewer than 100 such operations. Historian Kate Clifford Larson, speaking at a 2015 Kennedy Library Forum, noted that the American Medical Association had already warned that lobotomy remained too experimental to be considered safe or reliable. Freeman himself was not a trained surgeon. He was a neurologist who had adapted a technique he had observed in Europe and was promoting it with an evangelist's certainty and a showman's disregard for the limits of the evidence. Joseph Kennedy authorized the operation. That sentence appears in the JFK Library's own summary. It is not speculation, not inference, not the claim of an outside biographer working from second-hand sources. The most institutionally cautious, family-facing archive in the Kennedy universe confirms it. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. authorized the lobotomy of his daughter Rosemary. The operation took place in Washington in November 1941. What happened in that room has been described by Watts himself in later accounts. Rosemary was conscious. Freeman and Watts cut into the white matter of her frontal lobes, and they asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer and sing "God Bless America" as they worked, using her verbal responses to gauge how far to cut. According to Larson, they stopped when she became incoherent. She never recovered. The JFK Library states plainly that the lobotomy left Rosemary permanently incapacitated and unable to care for herself. The woman who had kept a diary, danced at embassy balls, and been presented at the Court of St. James's, could no longer walk properly, could no longer speak clearly, and could no longer live anything resembling an independent life. And the compound, the house Joseph Kennedy had built to project family strength, went on standing. The dock, the lawn, the sailboats, the structured dinners, the competitive games, the sense of a family in full command of its own story, all of it continued. The only thing that changed was that one daughter was no longer there. Rosemary did not return to Hyannis Port. She was sent first, according to Larson's account, to Craig House, a psychiatric facility in Beacon, New York. Later, she was transferred to St. Coletta's School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin, a Catholic institution run by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi, more than 1,000 miles from the Cape Cod waterfront, where her siblings would continue to spend their summers. The distance was not incidental. It was architectural. Wisconsin was far enough from Massachusetts, from Washington, from Palm Beach, and from the reach of the press that Rosemary could be cared for without being seen. Archbishop Richard Cushing, a close ally of the Kennedy family, helped facilitate the arrangement. The financial support was substantial and sustained. Joseph Kennedy ensured that Rosemary's care was funded generously. But the terms of that care included, for decades, an almost total separation from the family that was paying for it. Rose Kennedy's relationship with her daughter's absence is one of the most painful threads in this story, and one of the hardest to pin to a single documented truth. According to Larson, Rose later said she did not see Rosemary for 20 years after the lobotomy. 20 years. That figure, if accurate, means Rose Kennedy did not visit her daughter from 1941 until approximately 1961, a span that covers the entire ascent of the Kennedy political dynasty. From Joseph's maneuvering of his sons into public life through John's election to the presidency. Whether that absence was Rose's choice, Joseph's directive, or some more tangled combination of obedience, guilt, denial, and the particular emotional architecture of their marriage is not something the documentary record resolves cleanly. Larson herself is careful about this. What is documented is the result. Rosemary lived at St. Coletta's, and the Kennedy family's public narrative proceeded as if she had simply stepped off the edge of the frame. The compound, meanwhile, was entering its most consequential decade. While Rosemary adjusted to institutional life in Wisconsin, learning slowly to walk again with assistance, to speak in limited phrases, to perform small tasks, the house on Marchant Avenue was about to become the most famous private residence in American politics. In 1956, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, congressman, senator, war hero, and the second son elevated to firstborn status after Joseph Jr.'s death over the English Channel in 1944, purchased a house on Irving Avenue in Hyannis Port, adjacent to his parents' property. Robert Kennedy acquired a third house nearby. The compound was no longer a single residence, it was a campus. And in the fall of 1960, it became something no private American home had been before, the operational nerve center of a presidential campaign. The images from that autumn are among the most reproduced in American political photography. John Kennedy on the lawn, shirt sleeves rolled, tanned from sailing, surrounded by family members whose collective vitality seemed to argue that the country itself could be young again. Jackie Kennedy beside him, elegant and contained, the visual proof that this was not merely a political operation, but a family romance the nation was invited to join. Bobby Kennedy on the phone inside the main house, managing the war room. Rose Kennedy greeting reporters on the porch. Ted Kennedy, the youngest, everywhere at once. The compound projected exactly what Joseph Kennedy had spent 30 years engineering it to project. A family so alive, so unified, so confident in its own trajectory, that power seemed not grabbed but inherited, like the view of Nantucket Sound. In January 1961, John Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. By that summer, the Hyannis Port compound was designated the Summer White House. Secret Service details moved in. A helicopter pad was installed. Press briefings were held on the lawn. The address that had started as a rented cottage was now, in the eyes of the world, a seat of government, casual, glamorous, and drenched in the specific American promise that a family could be powerful and happy at the same time. Rosemary Kennedy was not there. She was in Jefferson, Wisconsin at St. Coletta's, where she had been living for nearly 2 decades. She did not appear in the campaign photographs. She was not mentioned in the press coverage of the Summer White House. When the family was counted for the public, she was either omitted entirely or referenced in the vaguest possible terms. A daughter who was teaching or involved in charitable work, euphemisms so opaque that they functioned less as explanations than as walls. The compound's most luminous period and Rosemary's deepest invisibility were not merely simultaneous. They were structurally dependent. The image of wholeness that Hyannis Port broadcast to the nation required the absence of the daughter whose existence would have complicated it. A family that included a severely disabled member, disabled by her own father's decision, could not easily sustain the myth of effortless vitality. The house did not merely benefit from Rosemary's absence, it needed it. Consider for a moment what the Kennedy compound accomplished as a piece of visual architecture. Before Hyannis Port, American political families were photographed in formal settings: the White House, the Capitol steps, the governor's mansion. They posed. They were stiff. They were institutional. The Kennedys, through their compound, invented something different: the political family at leisure, the touch football game, the sailboat race, the children tumbling across the lawn, the president in khakis, the wife in sunglasses, the enormous extended family spilling across a property large enough to absorb them all without ever looking crowded. That image was not an accident. It was the product of a house specifically configured to produce it: the lawn deep enough for games, the waterfront oriented for golden hour light, the multiple houses close enough to suggest a clan, but separate enough to imply that each family unit was also independent. The compound was, in the most literal sense, a set, and the production it staged was so convincing that it reshaped what Americans expected a powerful family to look like. But every set depends on what is kept out of frame, and the person most deliberately kept out of the Kennedy compound's frame was Rosemary. Her absence from the family photographs of the Camelot era is not the absence of someone who happened to be elsewhere. It is the absence of someone who had been placed elsewhere by a specific decision, made by a specific man, for specific reasons, that the family chose not to explain publicly for more than 2 decades. The silence held. Throughout John Kennedy's presidency, through his assassination in Dallas in November 1963, through the mourning that remade the compound into a national shrine of grief, through Bobby Kennedy's own presidential campaign and murder in 1968, the full story of Rosemary's lobotomy remained outside public knowledge. The family acknowledged her existence. Eunice Kennedy Shriver published a groundbreaking article in the Saturday Evening Post in 1962 describing a mentally retarded sister. But even that landmark piece did not name the lobotomy. It described Rosemary's disability as something the family had lived with, not something the family had caused. Eunice's article was an act of extraordinary courage within the Kennedy system. To acknowledge intellectual disability at all, in a family that had built its public identity on competition and excellence, was a rupture in the image the compound had been designed to maintain. But the courage had a boundary: the 1941 operation, the thing that had transformed Rosemary from a young woman with learning difficulties into a person permanently unable to care for herself, remained hidden. The compound's secret was not that the Kennedys had a disabled daughter. It was that Joseph Kennedy had made her that way. The physical architecture of the compound tells its own version of this story if you know how to read it. The National Park Service nomination describes the main house in granular detail. The president's bedroom, maintained as a memorial space, the sunroom where Rose Kennedy held court, the sports room and television room where the children gathered, the motion picture theater in the basement where Joseph screened films he had once helped produce, the servants' quarters tucked discreetly behind the family's living spaces. What the NPS inventory does not include is any room associated with Rosemary after 1941. There is no memorial space for her, no bedroom preserved in her name. The house that contains a room called the President's Bedroom does not contain a room that acknowledges the daughter who was removed from it. That absence is not an accusation. Historic houses preserve what their stewards choose to preserve, but it is a fact, and it rhymes with the larger pattern. The compound memorializes power. It memorializes political achievement. It does not, in its physical arrangement, memorialize what power cost. Joseph Kennedy Sr. suffered a massive stroke in December 1961, less than a year into his son's presidency. The stroke left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly for the remaining 8 years of his life. He died in November 1969. According to Larson, Joseph had visited Rosemary at St. Coletta's in the years following the lobotomy, but those visits grew less frequent over time and eventually stopped. The man who had authorized the operation that destroyed his daughter's independence spent his final years in the same compound he had built to project family strength. Himself now diminished, himself now dependent on care, himself now unable to articulate whatever he understood about what he had done. Rose Kennedy's trajectory was different but equally shaped by the compound's logic. She remained at Hyannis Port, the matriarch of a family that had become a national institution. She gave interviews. She attended events. She maintained the discipline of public composure that had defined her role since the 1920s. And for what Larson reports as 2 decades, she did not visit her daughter in Wisconsin. The question of why Rose stayed away is one the documentary record does not answer with a single clean explanation. Was it Joseph's directive, issued before his stroke and obeyed long after he could no longer enforce it? Was it Rose's own inability to face what had been done? Was it the institutional logic of a family in which the patriarch's decisions, once made, were treated as permanent architecture, like the house itself, not to be questioned, only maintained? Larson is careful about this ambiguity. The script must be equally careful. What is documented is the duration, 20 years. What is not documented, or at least not documented in a way that resolves into a single motive, is the interior of Rose Kennedy's decision to stay away. What can be said is that the compound functioned, during those decades, as if Rosemary's absence were simply a fact of the landscape, like the tide schedule or the position of the dock. The family gathered. The summers continued. The political careers unfolded. The grief of 1963 and 1968 was absorbed into the house's mythology. And through it all, one daughter remained in Wisconsin, cared for by nuns, funded by her family's money, and separated from the place that defined her family's identity. It is worth being precise about what the Kennedy family's silence regarding Rosemary actually concealed, because the layers are distinct, and they accumulated over time. The first layer was the disability itself. Before Eunice's 1962 article, the family did not publicly acknowledge that any Kennedy child had an intellectual disability. In the competitive, image-driven world Joseph Kennedy had built, a world whose physical headquarters was the Hyannis Port compound, disability was treated as a private matter, which in practice meant it was treated as a liability. The second layer was the lobotomy. Even after Eunice's article acknowledged Rosemary's disability, the fact that Joseph had authorized an experimental brain surgery that catastrophically worsened her condition remained hidden from the public for decades. The full account did not enter mainstream public knowledge until well after Joseph's death, and it was not the family itself that disclosed it. Biographers, journalists, and historians, working from medical records, interviews with surviving family members, and the accounts of people connected to the institutions where Rosemary was cared for, assembled the story piece by piece over the 1980s and 1990s. The third layer was the family's own internal reckoning. According to Larson, not all of the Kennedy siblings knew the full truth at the same time. The information traveled unevenly through a family whose internal communication was shaped by hierarchy, loyalty, and the specific emotional climate Joseph and Rose had established. Some siblings learned the details earlier than others. Some may not have fully understood what had happened until they were adults with political careers of their own. Each of these layers found its own accommodation within the compound. The house did not need to contain a locked room or a hidden document to function as a mechanism of concealment. It needed only to continue performing its primary role, projecting the Kennedy family as whole, vital, and unified, while the truth about one daughter's fate was managed elsewhere, in private conversations, in institutional arrangements, and in the enormous psychological effort required to maintain a public image that contradicted a private reality. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had built the compound to be a stage. The most consequential performance it ever hosted was not a presidential campaign or a summer White House press conference. It was the decades-long performance of family completeness while one member was missing. And the audience, the American public, believed it because the production was that convincing, and because the house was that beautiful, and because the family standing on its lawn was that compelling to look at. The performance did not end with Joseph's stroke or his death. It continued through the 1970s, as the full story remained largely unknown. It continued through Ted Kennedy's long Senate career, during which the compound served as both his home and his political base. It continued in diminishing form into the era when biographies and documentaries began to pull the thread. By then, the compound had been performing for so long that the performance had become indistinguishable from the place itself. Hyannis Port did not just house the Kennedys. It housed the version of the Kennedys that the Kennedys wanted the world to see. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. died on November 18, 1969, at the compound in Hyannis Port. He was 81 years old. He had spent the last 8 years of his life partially paralyzed and largely unable to speak, seated in the house he had built to amplify his voice across a continent. His death removed, among many other things, the gravitational center of the family's silence about Rosemary. And within a few years, something shifted. According to Kate Clifford Larson's account at the Kennedy Library Forum, Rosemary began spending more time with her siblings in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. She visited Hyannis Port. She visited Palm Beach. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who had already broken the family's public silence on disability in 1962, and had founded Camp Shriver in 1962, a summer day camp for children and adults with intellectual disabilities, held initially in her own backyard, was the sibling who most visibly reintegrated Rosemary into the family's orbit. The compound received Rosemary back, but it received her back as a woman in her 50s and 60s, not as the young woman who had been removed from it in her early 20s. The Rosemary who returned to Hyannis Port could walk with assistance, could speak in limited phrases, could recognize family members, and could participate in simple activities. She was not the Rosemary who had kept a diary about dances and concerts. She was not the Rosemary who had been presented at the court of St. James's. She was the Rosemary that Walter Freeman and James Watts had left behind in November 1941, plus 30 years of institutional care. The timing is the cruelest detail. By the time Rosemary began returning to the compound with any regularity, the era that had made the compound mythic was over. John Kennedy had been dead for years. Bobby Kennedy had been dead for years. The Camelot period, the summers of touch football and sailboats and presidential press conferences on the lawn, belonged to the past. Rosemary came back to a house whose most famous chapter had been written in her absence, and whose mythology had hardened into national memory without her in it. Eunice understood this, or at least she acted as though she did. Her response was not to undo the past, that was impossible, but to build something from it. The camp she had started in 1962 grew. The advocacy she had begun with her Saturday Evening Post article expanded, and in 1968, the year Bobby Kennedy was murdered, Eunice Kennedy Shriver organized the first Special Olympics International Summer Games in Chicago. 1,000 athletes competed. The event was funded by the Kennedy Foundation, and its intellectual origin was inseparable from the family's experience with Rosemary. The sister who had been hidden, the sister whose fate had shown Eunice what happened when disability was treated as a problem to be eliminated, rather than a life to be supported. The Special Olympics did not mention Rosemary's lobotomy. It did not need to. It existed because of it. Rosemary Kennedy's involuntary transformation, from a young woman with a mild intellectual disability into a person permanently incapacitated by an experimental surgery she did not choose, produced, through the conscience of her sister, one of the most significant disability rights movements in American history. That sentence contains an irony so severe that the temptation is to resolve it into either redemption or tragedy. The documentary must resist both. Eunice Kennedy Shriver did not build the Special Olympics as an act of atonement for her father's decision. She built it as an act of conviction. Her 1962 article had been explicit. She believed that people with intellectual disabilities were capable of far more than society assumed, and that the institutions where many of them were warehoused, institutions not unlike St. Coletta's, were failing them not through cruelty, but through low expectations. The camp she ran, the movement she founded, and the international organization she built over the following decades were practical expressions of that belief. But the belief had a source, and the source was a house in Hyannis Port where one sister's disappearance had demonstrated, more vividly than any policy paper could, what happened when a family, and by extension a society, decided that disability was incompatible with its image of itself. John F. Kennedy, before his assassination, had begun translating the family's private experience into public policy. In 1961, he established the President's Panel on Mental Retardation. In 1963, he signed the Maternal and Child Health and Mental Retardation Planning Amendment and the Mental Retardation and Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act, legislation that directed federal resources toward community-based care and away from the large residential institutions that had been the default for decades. Jean Kennedy Smith, another sister, would later continue the family's advocacy work. Anthony Shriver, Eunice's son, founded Best Buddies International in 1989, extending the mission into a new generation. The Kennedy compound was not the site where this legislation was drafted or these organizations were founded, but it was the place where the conditions that made them necessary had been most acutely lived. The house that had hidden Rosemary became, through its own history, the argument for why people like Rosemary should never be hidden. The family that had performed wholeness while one member was absent eventually produced the movement that insisted on inclusion. That is not a redemption arc. It is a consequence, one made possible by Eunice Kennedy Shriver's specific moral clarity, not by the family system that had caused the harm. Rosemary herself had no say in any of it. She did not choose to become the founding symbol of the Special Olympics. She did not choose to be the subject of biographies and documentaries. She did not choose to have her lobotomy disclosed to the public, or to become the lens through which the Kennedy family's darkest chapter was examined. She lived at St. Coletta's until January 7, 2005, when she died at the age of 86. She had spent 63 years in institutional care. The compound outlived her, as it outlived nearly everyone who passed through it. Edward Moore Kennedy, Ted, the youngest of Joseph and Rose's 9 children, made the compound his primary residence in 1982. For the next 27 years, the main house on Marchant Avenue functioned as the home base of the last Kennedy brother, the man who had inherited not just the property, but the full weight of the family mythology that had been built inside it. Ted Kennedy's relationship with the compound was different from his brother's. He had not used it as a campaign headquarters in the same way John had. He had not acquired his own adjacent house in the way Bobby had. He lived in the main house itself, the patriarch's house, the one Joseph had expanded and Rose had organized and the nation had watched on television. He lived there with the president's bedroom and the screening room and the sun porch and the servants' quarters and the lawn where the family photographs had been taken and the dock where the sailboats had launched and the accumulated memory of everything the address had meant and everything it had concealed. Ted Kennedy died on August 25, 2009, of brain cancer. He was 77. His death did not end the compound's story, but it ended its function as a living Kennedy residence in the way it had been since 1929. The property's future became an institutional question rather than a family one. In 2012, Victoria Reggie Kennedy, Ted's widow, known as Vicky, donated the main house to the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. The institute, which operates a full-scale replica of the Senate chamber in Boston as an educational center, took stewardship of what it calls the Kennedy Cape House. According to the institute's own description, the property is now available for limited docent-led tours from September through June, and proceeds from those tours support the stabilization and restoration of the home's historic elements. The language is precise and institutional: stabilization, restoration, historic elements, civic mission. The house that Joseph Kennedy built to project a private family's public ambitions is now managed by an educational nonprofit whose stated purpose is to inspire civic engagement. The transition is complete. The compound has passed from private stage to public exhibit, but the exhibit, like the house before it, must choose what to display. A docent-led tour of the Kennedy Cape House offers visitors the chance to walk through rooms where presidents planned, where senators strategized, where a matriarch maintained discipline across 4 decades. It offers the physical experience of standing inside American political history. What it cannot easily offer, because architecture does not confess, and because the compound's most consequential secret was not a room, but an absence, is the experience of understanding what the house was designed to keep out of sight. The compound's restoration preserves the structure. The question, for anyone who visits, and for anyone who tells the story of the house, is whether the preservation also extends to the truth the structure was built to contain. 3 white clapboard houses on Nantucket Sound. Roughly 6 acres of waterfront. A lawn deep enough to stage a presidency. A dock where sailboats launched into the same water that caught the golden hour light in 1,000 photographs. The Kennedy compound still stands, and it still looks, from the outside, like the image America learned to associate with family, power, and belonging. The house was built in 1904, purchased by a man rejected from a country club, and remade into the most recognizable private residence in American political life. It was the place where 9 children were trained to perform unity. It was the place where one of those children was included in the family portrait before she was removed from it. It was the headquarters of a presidential campaign, the summer White House of a young president, the home of the longest-serving Kennedy senator, and now a historic property administered by an educational institute. Each of those identities is real. Each of those identities is documented, and each of those identities rests on the same foundation. The foundation is not the soil beneath the house or the pilings under the dock. The foundation is the decision Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. made in 1941 to authorize an experimental lobotomy on his 23-year-old daughter because her behavior did not fit the image the family required, and the decades of silence that followed. The compound did not cause that decision, but it was the structure that benefited from it. Every photograph of the Kennedy family at Hyannis Port, every image of the touch football game and the sailing race and the press conference on the lawn, every frame of the Camelot mythology that made this house a national symbol, all of it was composed in the absence of Rosemary Kennedy. The picture looked complete because the person who would have complicated it had been removed. That is not a judgment the narrator imposes. It is a fact the architecture contains. The house has a president's bedroom. It does not have a Rosemary's room. The family photograph includes everyone who was allowed to remain. The compound's public meaning, vitality, togetherness, the American family at its most aspirational, was built on a private act of exclusion so total that it took decades and outside investigators to bring it fully into public view. Rosemary Kennedy lived 86 years. She spent the first 23 of them as a visible member of her family. She spent the remaining 63 in institutional care, first in New York, then in Wisconsin, eventually returning to Hyannis Port for visits that came after the era that had defined the compound's place in American memory. She did not choose the lobotomy. She did not choose the separation. She did not choose to become the absent center of her family's most carefully maintained image. And she did not choose to become, through her sister Eunice's conscience, the catalyst for one of the most important disability rights movements in American history. The compound held all of this. It held the ambition and the discipline and the exclusion and the performance and the grief and the silence and the slow, incomplete reckoning that followed. It held the family at its brightest and the daughter at her most invisible. It held the campaign and the presidency and the assassination and the widowhood and the Senate career and the institutional afterlife. It held, and it holds, the specific American belief that a house can make a family look whole, and the specific American proof that the appearance of wholeness is not the same as the thing itself. The lawn is still deep enough. The water is still visible from the porch. The house is still white, and Rosemary Kennedy is still the person the house was not built to remember, and the person without whom its story cannot be told.